You mentioned in that article in Forbes that President-elect Biden could work to address short and long-term fiscal needs by using something called a fiscal switch. So just very briefly, what is that and how would it work?
So the fiscal switch is a concept that says that the right fiscal policy is not the same at all times. In our current environment, we need deficit finance stimulus to support the economy. But when we're back at 4% unemployment and we have these longer term fiscal challenges, we need to start looking at addressing those structural problems and have a more deficit reduction focused mindset. And so what the fiscal switch idea is, it's a roadmap getting from one point to the other. So we start out and we say, how long do we need stimulus to go? Until the pandemic is resolved, until we get back to a certain unemployment rate. And as long as that's the case, we want to have increase the generosity of unemployment insurance benefits, provide aid to state and local governments, and support struggling businesses as needed. Then as the economy recovers, we start phasing down that stimulus when it's no longer needed to support the economy. That's the second phase of the fiscal switch. And then in the final phase, once the economy is really backfiring on all cylinders, we pivot to deficit reduction. And we view this as a framework that will make it easier for Republicans to go along with stimulus, knowing that it's not going to be a permanent deficit spigot in perpetuity. And Democrats will be more comfortable with the prospect of future deficit reduction, knowing that it won't prematurely cut off stimulus like deficit reduction efforts did following the financial crisis.
Well, something we harp on in the field, Brian, is the need for tough choices on fiscal policy to get us on a more sustainable long-term path. A couple of myths, I'm going to get a twofer out of this one. A couple of myths you highlight is one, that President Bill Clinton at the time and Newt Gingrich, they had courageous reforms that balanced the budget in the 90s. You say that's a myth. And you also said President Obama aggressively cutting deficits, also a myth. So how are those two things myths? We're always looking for strong leadership on fiscal policy. Did they fall short? Was something else involved? How are these possibly myths?
The danger is when people simply look at the trend of the deficit without looking at what caused the deficit to get bigger or smaller. And then they prematurely give blame or credit to politicians for things that they don't really have much responsibility for. In terms of the 1980s, we did get balanced budgets under President Clinton with Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House. But from the era of the peak deficit to the peak surplus, 80% of the deficit reduction was stuff that politicians really had nothing to do with. 80% of the deficit reduction was defense savings from the end of the Cold War, which had already happened before they took those positions, and the current revenue bubble from the economic bubble of the late 1990s. 80% of it was things that Clinton and Gingrich had nothing to do with. The final 20% were the Clinton tax hikes and the Gingrich spending cuts. And of course, the reason we had deficits afterwards is starting in 2002 is that the defense savings got blown up by the war by 9/11, and the revenue bubble burst. So those two factors that were driving the deficit reduction reverse, you go automatically from surpluses back to deficits. You also had some big tax cuts. Under President Obama, it is true the deficit fell. When he was elected, the deficit had already spiked from 160 billion to 1.2 trillion just because of the recession. What CBO said at the time was that if we do nothing at all, the recession will end in 6 months and the deficit will automatically drop back down to about $250 billion within a couple of years. Well, instead, we got a lot of stimulus spending, a lot of proposals that were quite expensive. You can agree that those are great ideas and the economy needed it, but it did increase the deficit. The deficit went up to 1.4 trillion in 2009 and stayed above $1 trillion per year through 2012, never fell below 438 billion again. So if you compare the deficit to the actual baseline of what was going to happen automatically, we got about $5 trillion in higher deficits under President Obama than the baseline. So while the deficit fell, it actually fell slower than it would have otherwise naturally. I'm not saying that these policies weren't good ideas. That's a separate discussion, but I'm just saying mathematically speaking, the deficit was supposed to have fallen faster according to the inherited baseline than it had.
I wanted to get back to a very fundamental point, aside from policy issues like taxes or healthcare spending. When we did the fiscal wake-up tour, one of the central elements was that everybody agreed that deficits matter, that the long-term projected unsustainability of the federal debt was a problem, and it could be addressed from different perspectives, from the left or from the right, different mix of taxes or spending, but that we couldn't just let the deficit run the way it was projected to do. And I wanted to get your take on that central premise, because we're seeing unprecedented deficits in debt right now, and it has gotten some people to think, well, geez, maybe deficits don't matter after all. So I want to get you both to just address that point about why deficits matter, to what extent, and how policymakers in the coming term might factor deficits into their options. And I'm not talking about COVID.
Right.
We're going to exempt COVID.
Right. Okay. Yes.
I'm talking about policy assuming post-pandemic.
Right. Okay. So policy post-pandemic, I think the deficit does matter, mainly because it's about hedging risk. I think that if you look at the share of our debt burden, what it's likely to look at in the future, some people will look at that and say, well, interest, as long as the interest rates are low, we can afford to carry this debt burden in perpetuity. It's not a threat. And even if that were true, and under CBO's current baseline, it's not true. But if you believe that interest rates are going to be even lower than CBO, you can make the argument that it is sustainable. The problem I see there is that it's taking a really big gamble, sort of on the order of magnitude of what we did with climate change in the 90s, where we say, well, it might be true, but it might not be true. And we'll kind of see what happens. And the risks are asymmetric. If you run responsible fiscal policy, and again, we're talking about outside of a recession, so there's not really a great economic harm in running responsible, small deficits when or balanced budgets when the economy is operating at full capacity. And it turns out that interest rates aren't that high. It's not a huge deal. Whereas if you accrue this giant debt burden and you're wrong about interest rates, then you have a really big problem in the future, and it becomes extremely difficult to keep your obligations, and that just creates an impossible situation for policymakers. And so I think
kind of like jumping out of the plane and hoping that your parachute opens, and what happens if it doesn't.
Sure.
So Brian, on to you. I think there's some openings there to talk about this giant gamble on interest.
Yeah, I mean, right now, CBO assumes that the debt is going to rise to 195% of GDP in 30 years. And that's with low interest rates. That assumes that the interest rate never rises above 4.4% ever again, which is even lower than it was as late as 2008. And given the fact that debt by itself should raise interest rates, it should actually be a driver of interest rates. 4.4% is optimistic. Let's say that interest rates exceed the CBO projections by 1 percentage point. Let's say they rise to 5.4% instead of 4.4%. In that instance, you add $30 trillion in interest cost over 30 years. You raise the 30-year debt from 195% of GDP to 264% of GDP. At that point, the budget deficit in 30 years is 17% of GDP. Now, usually for context, the government spends about 21 and taxes about 17. We would be running a deficit of 17% of GDP. This is just if you exceed the baseline by 1 percentage point and still have interest rates that are not significantly above historical averages. So as Ben said, the question is, are we feeling lucky? Do we want to gamble our entire fiscal future, our entire economic future, on the hope that interest rates never rise to 4, 5, 6% ever again? The cost, if we're wrong, is calamitous. because once you've already made the expenditures, you've locked in the big spending levels, you've locked in the lower tax levels, you're running deficits of 15% of GDP, it's really hard to unwind all of that. I mean, are you gonna start cutting everybody off of their Social Security and Medicare? Are you gonna double and triple it into income taxes? Keep in mind, the rest of the world isn't gonna bail us out, because when our debt is 120, 140 trillion dollars, as CBO projects, China and Japan can't bail out 120 or 140 trillion dollars. So maybe the better option is to phase in reforms now gradually so that we don't have that problem. Because once you're in that situation, it's too hard to unwind without really calamitous results.